Thanks. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation on a bright, sunny, and cool day. For those of you watching this via C-SPAN, welcome, and that was sarcasm, which we sometimes engage in at Heritage. All kidding aside, what a treat to welcome a longtime friend of Heritage, personal friend, close personal friend at that, and someone that I say, even accounting for my bias, is one of the visionaries of the conservative movement in the world. And I can say the first time I met Dr. Yoram Hazony several years ago now in Austin, Texas, I didn't know who he was. But about 5 or 10 minutes into that meeting, I realized at least two things about him. Number one, professionally, scholar to scholar, both of us think deeply about, or at least one of us thinks deeply about history and philosophy. You're about to meet him. That we could talk about not just the American founding and its legacy, but what we needed to do better in the United States and across the West to honor the principles of that founding. But the second thing, which was perhaps even more profound on a personal level, was Dr. Hazony's authenticity. And that authenticity, that sincerity, not just in his scholarly work, which is really the first obligation of a scholar, to treat his or her records, sources, ideas with as much objectivity and rigor as they can muster, but also the sincerity on the personal level, which I've come to know firsthand over the last several years, are both profound. And at a time when, to state the obvious, there's so much at stake, not just across the world, but I might argue particularly in this country, domestically, about where we go in honoring the founding, especially as conservatives, I just have to say on behalf of all of us at the Heritage Foundation that Yoram is one of the key leaders of that effort. And so it will be a treat to visit with him today. We'll have a conversation, and then we'll invite you into that conversation. Before that, though, please join me in welcoming Dr. Yoram Hazony. Yoram, welcome back to Heritage.
Thank you. Good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you. It's been a while.
Yeah, it is.
We're often collaborators. We'll talk about that. Some people believe that's a little bit of a conspiracy. And often we're doing that in conjunction with our friend Chris DeMuth, now at Heritage, longtime president of AEI. Mr. DeMuth, good to see you, sir. And this conversation is one that might very easily come to be focused on the past. But in fact, it's going to be one focused on the future. So you've written a lot of things in your career, even though you're still a very young man. And two of your most recent works, Conservatism, Rediscovery, and The Virtue of Nationalism, I think are formative for any of us engaged in politics and policy, but especially those of us who would categorize ourselves as conservatives. And as we sit here, a few days before this great country's 249th anniversary of its founding, I can't help but think that the last decade in particular, Brexit, Trump's election in 2016, have resurrected some of what you talk about in both of those books. What's your assessment of where things are today, especially given what seems to be an increase in awareness of sovereignty and national identity?
Well, I think that's true. I think we are seeing some kind of a resurrection. God willing, it's carried forth to fruition. It's been a pretty outrageous 10 years. I mean, when I think back to 2016, to the year first of Brexit, the British sinned against the European Union by declaring their independence. And then a few months later, Donald Trump asserts America first and gets swept into office. And I think seriously, when you think back about those days, they're very chaotic. On both sides of the Atlantic, we had elite opinion, the professors, the journalists, the policy people, a lot of the politicians talking like, the sky was falling, like the end had come. It was, some kind of, retreat into totally irrationality. and craziness, and there were no principles involved. And this book, The Virtue of Nationalism, which is now, after 7 years, it's been reissued by the publisher in an expanded edition, which is kind of an honor. That doesn't always happen, that the liberal publishing houses decide to do a second edition for a conservative book. And when you look at the 7 years that brought you here to Heritage, brought a bunch of other books by good friends of ours, established CPI, all sorts of pieces have fallen into place, in addition to the Trump administration itself, which now has welcomed, literally dozens of close friends are in the administration, hundreds of acquaintances. And it's ours to blow, but what a distance we've come. What an incredible honor to have been able to participate and see this attempt to turn America around, and with it, literally Western civilization. And for right now, it looks like it's working.
It does. So we're very optimistic. And so I want to talk about the future and some different aspects of the future. We'll try to touch on as much public policy as we can, but in a way that's actually exciting for those of you in the audience. But before we do that, I think we must define what national conservatism is, because we have many folks in the audience, maybe they haven't yet read your book. We have people who are watching this on C-SPAN. People will watch this for months and years to come. And we also have a number of people in the in-person audience who are from around the world, members of embassies, ambassadors, who are intrigued by this concept. They see what's happening, this revitalization of populism personified by President Trump, but also, and of course Heritage loves that and the following, the emergence of conservative populist fusion happening all over the world. It's great for self-governance and human flourishing. But I would argue you've played a role in that. Your book has played a role in that, because you actually gave voice, you articulated what national conservatism is. But before we go any further, how would you define it?
Sure. Well, let's start with nationalism. Nationalism is it's a political theory. It's a theory of political order. So when we talk about nationalism, it's not just, I'm a patriot of my own country, although you can use the word nationalist like that, but it's not just I'm a patriot, I love my country. Nationalism is a theory about how the world would best be governed, which sees a world of independent nations as being superior to the alternatives, to an anarchical system of tribes and clans on the one hand, and to the imperial state, to what used to be called an empire. Today they call it global governance, but it's still the same idea that there is this aristocratic elite that should just be able to make decisions for everybody. So the nationalist movements across the West, which continue to gain strength, they're about returning the idea of national independence, national sovereignty, the freedom of peoples to live according to their own traditions, their own religious understanding, but also their constitutional traditions, and their own political and economic interests. So that's nationalism. Now, you and I have had this conversation before, and every time you say something like, isn't national conservatism just a little bit redundant? And every time I immediately admit that it is, because
I'm glad you readily admitted that once again.
No, it's just true. If you're an American conservative, then nationalism is at the very founding. The idea that America is going to assert itself, its own unique inheritance, strongly colored by Britain, but still a unique inheritance, which is special and tailored for Americans, and which has contributed so much to the world. The idea that that should be empowered in an independent national state which makes its own decisions and is beholden only to God. That is so much at the bedrock of the American and also the Anglo-American inheritance that it's strange to even bother saying national conservatism. Really, conservatism in America should just always be nationalist, and you shouldn't have to say it. The reason we coined the phrase national conservatism when we did the first conference in 2019 in Washington, the reason we decided to go with that emphasis is because there were then, and there still are, so many people who are confused. They're confused about what conservatism is. And you literally still to this day, I mean, I opened the book with that, but still to this day, there are holdouts who are sitting around and saying, what Americans have to conserve is liberalism. By the way, there are also English who say that, French who say that, and Germans who say it. Everybody thinks their own country is exceptional, and in what way? We're exceptional in the way that we're liberal from our birth, somehow, and they read their history that way. And what are we conserving? We're conserving liberalism. Okay, and the idea of every person created in the image of God, and the freedom and equality before the law and other elements that are part of liberalism. They're actually much older. They're part of our conservative tradition. But liberalism, certainly in every version of it that we've had after the Second World War and probably after the First World War, liberalism has been about abandoning everything but the freedom, everything but the individual liberties, everything but equality. In other words, let's do an experiment after World War II. We will eliminate God and Scripture first, and then family and nation. And then after that, man and woman. We're just going to keep going, eliminating until there's nothing left but the absolute total freedom of the individual. Well, that liberalism is the opposite of conservatism. It's as Roger Scruton put it in a famous line in a book, it's the enemy of conservatism. If you insist that the only value, or the as Hayek says, the supreme value is the liberty of the individual, then what does that individual have liberty from? Well, it's liberty from tradition. It's liberty from being a conservative. It's liberty from having to give honor to your own traditions in America, Christianity, and especially giving honor to the constitutional founding. There's so many people today who say this is not relevant anymore, and the reason they think that it's not worth conserving is because we've raised them as liberals. So yes, we have a mission to restore that great constitutional and religious American heritage, and part of our fight today is to understand that people who are claiming, no, America stands for nothing but liberalism, they're actually selling the suicide of the West. They're selling the end of America. They're selling cutting off the real tradition at its roots, and that's a tough job. I look forward to being able to drop the word national and to meeting here 10 years from now, and we'll just say it was just conservatism all along. But
I've never heard that concession before. Yeah, it was.
But for now, we need to emphasize we aren't globalist conservatives. We're not conserving liberalism. We're national conservatives.
So that poison pill of properly or improperly understood liberalism manifests itself in public policy. It also manifests itself, I would argue, more importantly, in institutions, not just universities, K-12 schools, Rotary clubs, bowling leagues,
baseball teams, Little League baseball teams, but institutions like the family. How do we conserve those things when so much of them have been eroded by that project?
It's a tough question, and in a sense, it's, it's almost the only question. Conservatism, it assumes that conservatism is a view of politics that assumes that at the center of public life is a life of conservation and transmission, of researching what's in the past, pulling it down, dusting it off, sometimes fixing it where it's broken, and then transmitting it. And one of the great tragedies of the last few generations in the United States and Britain and elsewhere is people who are genuinely conservative, and they really do want to inherit and transmit the great things that came from the past. But transmission and conservation and transmission it's a skill. It's not something you can read in a book and know how to do it. It's a skill that's handed down. And what's happened is that that skill has itself evaporated. So that for example, a young man and a young woman want to get married. They want to do it the old way. They want to raise a family. And they want to stay together forever, and still they end up getting divorced. And there's a lot that has to do with the techniques of how do you keep a family together, how do you keep a nation together, which is no longer common. It still exists in certain places. So, but let me give you like a hint of what I'm talking about. The most important commandment, biblical commandment, having to do with conservation and transmission is honoring your parents. Right? Honoring your parents is something that most of the current young generation and many of their parents know that they no longer know what that is. Like, so when you start, so what is honoring? Well, honoring is setting out, you know what, I'm not your equal. Like, actually, you're my parent, you're my boss, you're my commanding officer, you're the president of the United States, and you are not my equal. You are actually above me in an extremely consequential way, and I owe you not just like an equal respect that I owe every person on earth, plus the dogs and cats. A honoring means I have to talk and act in such a way as to increase the weight that you have in everybody's eyes. Right now, that's hard. I talk to young people and I tell them, honoring your father and your mother means acting so as to increase the weight and importance that they have in everyone else's eyes and in their own eyes and in yours. And immediately all the hands go up. Doctor, what if they spanked me when I was a kid? It's just
even better.
Right. No, it's really hard because, and I mean, this gets at sort of at the heart of why liberalism, when it's a theory of let's tolerate other people and not persecute them, then it sounds great. The moment that you get to everyone is absolutely equal, everyone's perfectly equal, you teach all the kids, from the time they're small, no, you're perfectly equal to everybody. So then they start saying, okay, well, so I'm perfectly equal to my parents, so they have no right to talk to me, to talk to me the way they do. In fact, I'm the stranger at the gates, the people in Mexico who've come from all over the world to bang on the doors, saying, I'm perfectly equal, I'm perfectly free, let me in. And what are you going to do? You're going to say, no, I'm not going to let you in. They're perfectly free and they're perfectly equal. Why aren't you going to let you in? All of these, this complex of seemingly insolvable problems begins with the fact that all of us, and now I include myself, all of us have been raised in a society where we have kind of this voice that says, no, don't say that anybody's better than anybody else. Don't say you want to honor those who get married above those who don't, because that sounds unpleasant, right? Everybody just shifted in their seats. Don't say I'm going to honor those who serve in the military more than those who don't. Like, because everybody's supposed to be like free to be you and me. The moment that you take that step and you say, I'm changing my life. I'm going to live my life biblically, which means that I do distinguish between people who decide to get married and those who don't, between those who serve and those who don't, between my parents and me, between the president and me. And I don't allow myself to say anything whatsoever that I want to say about the president of the United States. The moment you cross that threshold, then for the first time, you're actually a conservative. You stop being a liberal, seeing the whole world this flatland, like we're all absolutely perfectly equal. And then the possibility of learning and transmitting that chain, the chain is built by honoring. I can learn from my parents and teachers, my clergymen, from scripture, from the past, from the Constitution, from the tradition. I can learn because I give honor and I make myself smaller and I see how big they were. That allows me to learn. And if my children and the next generation, if they do that, then they can have it handed down. If we don't do this, then we can't conserve and we can't transmit.
You mentioned living biblically. And one of the key themes, in fact, I would argue it's one of the major contributions of your book, is trying to restore, just among conservatives, although it'd be wonderful if other people found this restored in their lives, an understanding of how central, how vital being religious is. And knowing our religious patrimony, whatever that tradition, particular faith tradition may be. It seems to me that if we start connecting the dots here, we're going to eventually talk a little bit about public policy, but upstream of that, or at least mostly upstream from that, the deterioration of institutions, the deterioration, shall we say, of living biblically, put another way, the deterioration of religiosity among people in the West, including increasingly Americans. It seems as if, therefore, we have to fix that in order to fix these other problems, these other institutions.
Yeah.
And if so, how do we do that?
Well, I'll tell you how not to do it. Insisting that everybody's going to have to become a believer in things that they don't believe in, that they've been raised to not believe in. It's probably the case that most Americans at this stage just don't really have too many friends who are serious Christians. I mean, there are places where there are lots of them, but in half the states, you can grow up. Even where I grew up in Princeton, New Jersey, and there were like these two kids who were like really special because they were Christians. I mean, this is already a long time. This is like in the dinosaur age, and it was already true then.
You're saying Princeton is not the Bible Belt?
It's not. No.
Newsflash.
No. Even then, it wasn't. If you think that just constantly saying no, but you've got to believe that's going to get us where we need to go. Look, it'll work with some people, and it's worth doing everything we can to teach Christianity and Judaism to the extent that we just can. But I think that for this generation, it's really important to be able to say, look, you may not be a believer. In fact, at this point, you may never have read the Bible, much less know what it's about. I mean, it's just the most common thing in the world that even in the conservative movement, even among nationalist conservatives, you find that they really know almost nothing about Scripture. And if they do, by the way, then it's the New Testament, which is fine, but there's another 80% of the Bible, the Christian Bible, that they don't know and they don't understand. And so the first step for most people has got to be saying to them something like, look, you can see where this country is going. You understand that all good things are being leveled. And we need to be able to hand things down to future generations. And, you know, whatever you believe, you should be able to understand that the main engine of transmission was always the church. It was always religious families, religious communities, religious movements. Without that, there never would have been a conservatism. That was the heart, the absolute beating heart of conservatism, is that religious inheritance. So people who have not grown up with it, at this point, once, let's say they make the decision, yeah, I don't want to be a liberal. I want to give honor where honor is due. So the first thing to do then is give honor, go to church. Give honor, start studying scripture with your friends, with the teacher, and I always tell everybody, just stop worrying about whether you can prove that God exists, or that you believe that such and such. Just stop. You're missing the point. The point is, give honor where it's due. This inheritance, it shaped you. It created everything that's good in the political and moral universe that we live in. Giving honor means it's time for you to stop pretending that you can just ignore it. You can't ignore it. Ignoring it is the same thing as throwing it all away. You have to take the step, motivated by willing to give honor where it's due. And I'll just give you a hint. For most people, if they start going to church every week and they start meeting with people who are believers, and if you're humble enough to be able to learn from them, give them honor as people who know things, most people end up, within a few years, they start to understand that the way they were looking at it before was wrong, and things start to shift, and then they start learning. Learning is possible, but it's just not possible by going, God, prove to me that you exist. Prove it. It doesn't, I've tried it. That doesn't work. It doesn't, you got to do something else.
That seems to be advice applicable to someone of any age, but perhaps especially so for younger generations in the United States. You think about millennials and Generation Z, and the problem we can sympathize with, this is not to malign them, a lack of a sense of belonging. To some extent, a lack of a sense of identity, which is related in the deterioration of nationalism, properly ordered. That the advice you just gave is something that, in particular, younger Americans, younger people in the West might be willing to listen to, because it's not proselytizing, as it were, which is, of course, not acceptable in proper classical liberal societies, right? It ought to be, as a matter of national future. What would be the second step? Is it merely immersing themselves in that community? Would there be reading that you would suggest they do? We have a number of heritage interns who are in here, who are watching, who will be watching this. Our Executive Vice President, Derek Morgan, in the back, and I, when we welcome every heritage intern class here, 60 young people every time, we give them the same advice. Find a church on Capitol Hill and keep going. It's that. We're non-sectarian. What's the second step?
Okay. Actually, the pre-step, the first step, I would say, is reorganize yourself to the way you look at things, to give honor where it's due. That's the first step. And then the question is, where do I give honor? And then you get to church, you get to synagogue. You say, I've been very far from the tradition. I give it no honor. I'm going to now give it honor. I'm going to start devoting. That's the second step. The third step is the one that's really going to throw everybody. The third step is you need to get married.
I was hoping we would get to that.
Yeah, no, but it's, look, here's the truth. The truth about marriage is that the longer you wait to get married, the harder it is to get used to getting married, and the harder it is to stay married. And it's like the opposite of like, it's the opposite of what like the liberal individualism tells us. No, first you need to build yourself up. You need to be somebody. You need to explore yourself. You need to exercise your free. How can you make choices? There's a billion choices. How can you make choices if you don't spend 35 years exploring every, no, don't take away my, no, it's, the reality is the opposite. So I'll just quote a very famous rabbinic tradition. I'm sure that exists in Christianity also. The rabbinic tradition, looks at the story of Adam and Eve, and says the truth is that they began as one, and then they were separated into male and female. But you're only half a person until you're married. Okay, notice that these rabbis were not afraid of being politically incorrect, right? Like they didn't say, footnote, except for people who don't feel like getting married, or except for people who can't find, like, they understand that life is challenging and people aren't cookie cutters, and not every single person can be the same as every other person. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a norm that you're aspiring to. And the norm from the perspective of the rabbis interpreting the Bible is actually, you're not even a whole person. You're not a complete person until you and your wife, you and your husband, until you've come together. My wife and I, we were married. It was right after college for me. She was still a student when we got married. So I was 23, she was 22, and our daughter Avital was born her senior year. And that was on a liberal university campus, and everybody's, all enlightened, and we were, there were, no, seriously, there were like 7,000, there was like 5,000 undergraduates and another, 1,500 graduate students, and there were two married couples on the campus. There were like us and these like vegans, and that, it was just, like you had to be like a total fringeoid to like get married as an undergraduate. But and people kept, you're going to think I'm making this up. People would walk up to us on the campus and walk up to me and say, "How could you do that to her?" Like what?
They should have asked that about the vegan.
Right. And I'll never forget this. There was like we were in the kosher dining hall, and there was this gentlewoman, this sort of older woman who, like, we walked in and she had heard that we were getting married, and she said, "It's gonna end in divorce, I promise you." No, I mean, everybody's telling you no, but it doesn't change the fact that there is a best way to live, and the best way is to jump in when you're younger and you still are not completely formed, and you can develop your aims and your dreams together. You can find the answers to all those questions together. That's much easier than doing it 15 or 20 years later. And I have to say now I wrote about this, the last chapter of the Conservatism book, Conservatism, A Rediscovery, is about me and my wife, Julie, us meeting in college, and it's about all of these kinds of issues. What I didn't write about, which maybe I will sometime, is if you don't get married young, all right, that was the third step. And the fourth step is, and raise your kids to live somewhere in proximity to you, not, like you here in DC and them in Seattle or, Japan or something. You raise them to live in proximity with one another. Now, I'm not saying this is easy. Teenagers don't just do what their parents tell them to do. By the way, your wife also doesn't just do what like nobody does what you tell them to do. That's the reason that honoring one another is such a central commandment. It doesn't make it into the 10 Commandments without being like incredibly difficult. It's like, do not murder. Also, honor your father and your mother. Like that's like it's incredibly difficult to do. But the fourth piece of this, of conservation and transmission, is you want to be raising your children to live near you and to get married young and to have children. And if you do this, so here I am. I got there. So we now at this point have 4 of our 9 children are married, and all 4 of those couples have started having children, and so everybody's in Jerusalem. Some are farther away. It takes them a couple of hours to walk to our house on the Sabbath. Some of them are in the neighborhood. What that means is, yeah, there's a war. There's a war in Israel. It's not easy. There are things about it that are incredibly difficult. But here's the thing that nobody ever tells you. Nobody ever tells you that, when there's a war and school's canceled, then, and some of your kids are off at the war, all the grandchildren, they pile into your house. And there's like summer camp for grandchildren, like in your living room, round the clock for weeks, and you take them down to the bomb shelter. And I don't know how to express this to you, that the payoff for investing in giving honor, going to church, getting married within the church, no intermarrying, please, getting married within the church, agreeing on something and going forward, and then raising kids to be near you. The payoff is that, it says, there's this famous verse from the Psalms, Od yenevun v'seva d'shanim v'ra'ananim yiyu, which means, in English, it's going to happen, it's still going to happen, that you'll bloom and flower in old age, well watered and fresh, like as though you're young. That's according to Scripture. That's the life of the Torah. Is you reach old age, and instead of being, sitting around thinking, oh, I don't look as good as I used to look, all the things I missed. Instead of that, you've got all these children who are, most of them are honoring you, some of them are not, but we do our
Everyone's
best.
on a journey,
Right, absolutely. Look, everybody's got free will. We're only talking about what we're trying to do. We're only talking about what's the godly thing to do, what's the good thing to do. We're not talking about what everybody's going to do. But when you reach this point and you have all these children and you have all these grandchildren, and don't believe John Locke when he says that at the age of 20, you don't have any obligations to your parents, and they don't. Just forget all of that. Just forget it. None of it is true. They want you to keep teaching them forever. They want to be able to keep honoring you so that they can keep learning from you forever. And again, I'm saying it's not every single kid. Everyone's different. But the principle is, no, you continue, to see my wife, Julie, to see her teaching her daughters and her daughters-in-law how to be a mother, right? And don't buy the stuff, that you see in the, online. Somebody just, I just figured out why people don't die after they have children. Like evolution. Like, I'm working this out. Just hear me out. The reason there are grandparents and they stay alive from an evolutionary perspective is because evolution designed it that there would be babysitters.
God has a plan.
Right. He's got a plan. So no. The reality is beyond what you can imagine. But if you start visiting traditional religious communities, you'll see it immediately, is that the grown-up children are still learning from their parents. And the parents continue teaching them up until the time that the parents teach them how to be parents. The parents keep teaching their children up until the time that physically they can no longer continue to be to be the exemplars and the models and the teachers, and then it switches, and then you have an obligation to take care of them in old age, which almost nobody does anymore. You can pay somebody to do that. It's such a better life, and people are saying, I feel lonely. I don't have a direction. I don't understand what it's all about. Like, what's the meaning of this? Like, I got to read some more Nietzsche, or worse. No, Heidegger. Let me, the being of being. Like, I'll get this straight. I'll figure it out. No. It's so much simpler, but it's so much more complicated. You have to go visit these communities that where the tradition is alive and it's being conserved and transmitted, and get close to them. And you start to see miracles, and you just see that human beings can be something just so much more impressive than what we think that they should be.
I talked to you all evening. No conversation we've ever had has been long enough. But I need to be a good host and turn to the audience for at least a few questions. And so if you have a question, raise your hand and do me two favors. The first is wait for the microphone to come around. One of my colleagues would do that for our folks on the broadcast. And then secondly, please phrase your long comment in the form of a short question. Yes, sir. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for being here today. You mentioned John Locke, and he's kind of considered the father of classical liberalism. What is your view of his expounding of natural rights, and where does that fit within your vision of conservatism?
Great question.
Yeah, excellent question. Do we want to do some small, easy questions as a warm-up, or just get started with
I think our friend is quizzing the professor.
Yeah. Okay. Well, look, a couple of things. First of all, John Locke, and he writes this explicitly in his essay concerning human understanding in Book 4. At the beginning of Book 4, he explains that really, if you were to deal with moral questions, when he says moral, he means moral and political. Moral and political questions, if you were to deal with them, the proper way, later we call this Enlightenment rationalism, but if you're going to do it the right way, then you need to treat morals and politics, like a geometric proof, like it's Euclid with like self-evident premises and infallible deductions, and from there we'll get to absolute truths. Okay, and so people ask, like, what's the relationship between his big treatise on understanding and his two treatises on government? And that's the relationship. The relationship is the second treatise is his attempt to carry out this turning politics into a geometrical proof with things that are with self-evident premises that you can deduce from. He thinks that these are universally accessible to reason, meaning every person on earth. You can be in Afghanistan, to pick a completely arbitrary, not relevant example. According to this theory, you can be in Afghanistan and a devout traditionalist tribalist society, and still, when somebody comes to explain to you the self-evident premises, you'll get it. You start with all men are perfectly equal by nature. All men are perfectly free by nature. I didn't insert the perfectly. That's Locke himself, because it's a mathematical proof. So everything has to be perfectly true, not just true. And look, I write about this some in The Virtue of Nationalism and more in Conservatism, a Rediscovery. I think his system, that approach of thinking that there are these self-evident truths that Americans can just go to Kabul, set up a liberal arts college, bring in the kids, and start saying, okay, isn't this self-evident? And they'll all say, yes, why didn't we think about it before? It isn't true. Just you don't have to tell anybody I said that, but just between us, it's not true. It isn't true. Human societies are somebody must have said this once, they are diverse. They grasp reality in different ways. And I'm not saying there's no truth. There is a truth. There's the way God sees things. That's what we're looking for. But human societies grasp things from different directions. And there's no such thing as a set of mathematical axioms for morals and politics that can allow you to just prove the right answer. That's just not true. So I think that there are tremendous things worthy of honoring in the Anglo tradition. I usually prefer the conservatives, who I think are more realistic than liberal rationalists like Locke. But there are things to learn from Locke also. But the main caution I would have is when you start turning Locke into scripture, like into a substitute for scripture, because I'm not saying he meant to do this, but this is what people do today. There's all these people who say, look, we've got self-evident premises, we can do infallible deductions, we can get to all the truths we need. All we need to do is read Locke. And that's, by the way, that's one of the central reasons why so-called conservatives don't read the Bible anymore, is because what do they need it for? Because they've got Locke. I'm sorry if I'm being a little bit pushy. I can say I'm upsetting certain people, but there is some of this going on. And so I would just say John Locke is an important part of the Anglo-American tradition, but at this moment in history, he is honored to such an incredible degree. It's like Kant in Germany. He's honored as though he's scripture, and it's way, way, way overboard, and it needs to be brought down, and scripture needs to be brought up, and that will solve a lot of problems.
Yoram, on Locke, you're challenging secular dogma that Locke is the godfather of the United States. That's inaccurate, and therefore what you're saying is glorious. So thank you for that corrective. Yes, in the back.
My name is Cammy Butt, and what you just said is kind of contradictory to Islamic, Judaism, and Christian teaching that you should always associate and stay involved with your parents. But doesn't what John Locke said make Western society unique and very strong and very productive? Because when you kind of distance yourself from your parents, when you are 20, you become very independent, very aggressive, very productive. So isn't this the major reason that Western society have a lot more higher income per capita than those Eastern society like India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, or even Middle Eastern countries? Thanks.
Thank you.
Wow, there's a number of really big, interesting questions there. I don't know if I'm going to be able to hit them all. Look, with regard to teenagers, okay, first of all, even before they're teenagers, small children resist their parents. Like, by the time they're 2, they're already like testing out resisting their parents, rebelling and seeing what they can get away with. By the time that they enter adolescence, human beings are programmed to furiously and energetically revolt against the constraints of their parents and clash with them. Not every teenager does that, thank God. There are some loyalists, and they help us through the rest of it. But still, it's the case that for at least half the teenagers and probably 2/3, there's a powerful pre-programmed drive to push away your parents' inheritance and to move away, to try different things and to set up your own space. Now, a lot of those kids end up coming back if you don't do too much damage. If they and you don't do too much damage during this process, but I don't think that the natural adolescent inclination to say to your parents, I'm your equal. You can't talk to me like that. I know better than you. What is all this inheritance about anyway? Give me a break. That natural inclination is plenty. We do not need grand political theories of why the teenagers are right so that the whole society can be organized around making people just be teenagers forever. No, there's no advantage. There just isn't. And I mean, the question, where does capitalism come from? That's a wonderful question. I'm not an expert in that, but you have to go back and read the Old Testament politically and look at all the different places where the question of taking possessions, the government taking possessions away, or restricting the use of possessions. Look at how many times that comes up. Capitalism is a long and extraordinary and fascinating history, long before liberalism came along.
We have just a few minutes left, and I'm going to ask the last question on behalf of a lot of people in the audience. It's a big question, but we only have a few minutes because of the broadcast. And it is about public policy, but rather than a specific policy issue, unless you want to cite one or two as examples, it's about the approach. So a lot of conservatives in the United States and the West, probably some of our friends from international friends who are here, who are conservatives, are grappling with something that seems to be a dilemma, which is we do believe in limited government, and let's just posit that we accept your diagnosis and mine that classical liberalism has contributed to the deterioration of institutions, thereby creating social, economic, and cultural problems that if you're an elected official, when you take a moral oath, you have a moral obligation to help fix. But what's the proper role of government in fixing those problems?
Right. It's a tremendous question. Since I only have a little bit of time, I recommend Chapter 2 in Conservatism, A Rediscovery, which is about the American founding. And the American founding, there were two political parties. This is something that's easy to look up, but usually we don't learn this in school, and it's not, a lot of people don't think of it this way. There are two political parties. One of them is usually called Jeffersonian, and the other is usually called Hamiltonian, although that's itself liberal propaganda, because the Hamiltonian party was George Washington's party. And what people don't want to say is that it was Washington versus Jefferson all along. Washington, the founder of this, the father of this country, was not a Jeffersonian liberal. He was a conservative. And if you start to dig into the Federalist Party, Washington, Hamilton, Jay, but also names that are less known. Gouverneur Morris, who was the primary author of the Constitution. Nobody ever talks about him. And John Jay and others. When you start to look into that, you'll see that this conservative, this nationalist conservative party that founded America, certainly, was not in favor of. I'm sure that none of them would have been happy to see 4 million, federal employees or something. I mean, nobody dreamed of this kind of monstrosity. But still, there's a big difference because Jefferson's a kind of utopian, and he believes that if government just leaves you alone, everything's going to be fine. And Washington and Hamilton and Jay and their party stands for what they called energetic government, vigorous government, unitary government, like the theory of the unitary executive that conservatives are wrestling with right now. Is it possible that the founders intended for the president of the United States to have no authority for hiring and firing the people who run the government and are carrying out? I mean, it's a crucial issue, but understand that the energetic government, vigorous government, is the only kind of good government. Now, government can be very large or it can be very small, but that's not the same thing. It can take away a fantastically large chunk of GDP, or it can take a smaller chunk. It can regulate a lot or not regulate a lot. But the size of government, do we want big government or small government? I don't know any conservative who actually, almost none, who actually wants big government. Yeah, what we've got now is just great. It makes lots of sense. Nobody wants it. But the argument about if you're Republican, if you're conservative and you're elected to office, is your job to just sort of sit there, and allow the spontaneous order to unfold? No, not. Look, there's some liberals who think that, but there are no conservatives never thought that. Conservatives think human nature is crummy, it's problematic. Human societies, even when things are going really well, they inevitably decay. There is no possible way of avoiding the fate of human societies that in order for them to be picked up, like we're seeing right now, in order to restore the lost justice and grandeur and freedom of the nation, in order to restore the virtues, to restore religion, there has to be energetic government. And thank God, we in the conservative movement, we are gradually freeing ourselves with a lot of help from President Trump and the Heritage Foundation and lots of other good people, freeing ourselves from this absurd prejudice that the job of a conservative is to just sit and watch things decay because exercising government power makes you a fascist or something. No. Conservatism means restoration, and restoration means energetic government.
From your lips to God's ears. So a couple of housekeeping details before we wrap formally. Number one, thank you all, those of you especially here in person, those of you who've joined the broadcast, thanks for being part of the conversation. Number two, those of you here in person, as soon as we've concluded, when you exit through the back doors, there is a reception to which you're all invited just across the hall. Most importantly, please join me in thanking Dr. Yoram Hazony. Good job. Really good.